Good day again, grade 10. Pangalawang topic na pag-uusapan natin ngayon sa araw na ito. Kasi kanina, yung lesson ko ay inabot lang ng 35 minutes. So, dagdagan pa natin para may mas matutunan pa kayo. Okay? So, ang additional na topic na idudugtong ko sa print media is, or under also by print media, ay walang iba kundi itong Philippine Comic Books. Okay? Pag-uusapan natin ito ngayon. Okay? Ang Pilipinas class, nag-umpisa ito na mag-publish ng mga comics noong, ang tawag pa nito ay comics. Ayan, sa Pilipinas, ang term natin dyan ay yung comics. At ito ay nag-umpisa noong 1920s. Okay? Imagine nyo, 1920s pa lang, meron na tayo ng ganyan. Okay? So, ito ay kadalasang lingguhan, or weekly, or monthly. Okay? So, ano-ano class yung mga tawag nito? Ano-ano class yung mga institusyon na nangunguna dyan sa pagpuproduce o pagpapublish ng mga comics na yan. Number 1, yung liwayway. Alam nyo, class, naabutan ko tong liwayway, yung mga lumang liwayway. Naabutan ko ito. Elementary ako. Na 2005? Ganon. Liwayway. Then, pangalawa, itong bulaklak. Tama ba? O nga, bulaklak na. Bulaklak. Okay. So, sila yung mga nangunguna dyan, class. At ito, class, itong liwayway nito, bulaklak na to, lingguhan sila o monthly sila kung mag-produce ng kanilang mga comics. After nila i-produce, ito man ay na ta-translate sa iba't ibang uri ng mga dialects dito sa atin. May Bisaya, may Tagalog, may pang-Ilocano. Okay? So, ano-ano na, ang mga genre naman, class, na umiikot dito sa comics na ito, kadalasan dyan una ay yung nakakatawa. Or yung tinatawag natin dito na comical or yung comedy. Okay? Next, mayroon din tayong tinatawag dito na romance. Meron din namang horror. Okay? So, meron ding adventure. Okay? So, at marami pa. Marami pang mga iba't ibang uri ng mga genre yan. So, again, ang comics, nag-umpisa ito noong 1920s. Ito ay lingguhan o monthly na ipinoproduce. Ano-anong mga korporasyon na nagpapalabas niyan? Itong liwayway at yung bulaklak. Okay? Mga genre naman niya, eto. Okay? Next, ang mga pioneer naman, class, sa paggawa nitong mga comics na to noong 1920s ay walang iba kundi si number 1, si Romualdo Ramos. At pangalawa, nawala. At pangalawa ay si Antonio Velasquez. Okay, si Romualdo Ramos at saka si Antonio Velasquez. Romulo Ramos and Antonio Velasquez. Okay. Sila yung mga pioneers, class, ng comic books dito sa Pilipinas. Sila ay nagkakaroon ng collaboration, class, sila ay nag-collab sila para mabuo ang kauna-unahang iconic Philippine comic book. Kumaga parang yung kauna-unahang sumikat na comics dito sa Pilipinas, walang iba kundi itong Kengkoy. Okay? Next naman, ang comics naman daw ay hindi, sa panahon nila class, hindi lamang sapat na magaling kang mag-drawing. Okay? So, sa comics din, kinakailangan din ito class yung tinatawag natin na magaling ka din ng storyteller. Okay? So, for additional information, tayo dito ng history of Philippine Comics. Ayan.
The comics industry in the Philippines has been present since Jose Rizal drew The Monkey and the Tortoise in 1886. Then, in 1929, the comics industry in the Philippines emerged, and it was called as the Platinum Years of Comics in the Philippines. During this period, there were two kinds of comics that were popular: entertainment and editorial comics. The first comic that was published under Liwayway magazine was an entertainment comic called Mga Kabalbalan ni Kengkoy, written by Romulo Ramos and illustrated by Tony Velasquez. Editorial comics were printed mostly in the Philippines Free Press, and the content of these comics were about political and social criticisms. Some of the creators of these comics were Easy Izon and Ireneo Miranda. In 1942, Tony Velasquez created a series called Kalibapi Family for Tribune magazine, the newspaper that could circulate during the time when the Japanese Imperial Army occupied Manila. The 50s till the early 70s were considered as the golden age of comics in the Philippines. New titles such as Tagalog Classics and Hiwaga Comics came through after the war. The genres became more diverse during this period, hence the rise of comics about Philippine mythology, myths, and superheroes. Creators of the comics during this period were Alfredo Alcala, creator of Action Comics, Francisco Conching, creator of Pedro Penduko, and Mars Ravelo, creator of Darna and Captain Barbell. This was also the period when comics were adapted to films. In the 70s, there was a decline in the production of comics because of the declaration of martial law. The comics written during martial law were about praising the Marcoses' programs. Tony Velasquez wrote a fantasy novel about the Green Revolution of Imelda Marcos. After lifting the martial law, the comics industry began to generate new readership. Genre like heavy drama arose in the industry. Supernovels were born after the martial law as well. Average comics only had a length of 20 issues, while supernovels were comics that contained more than 50 issues. Dominating this field were writers like Pablo S. Gomez, known for Kampanerang Cuba and Petrang Caballo, and Nerissa Cabral, known for Between Walang Ningning. Superheroes were still present in the scene like Carlo J. Caparaces, Ang Panday, and Totoy Bato. In the late 80s, Paul Medina Jr.'s Pugad Baboy illustrated about the social-political issues and represented them through his characters. The comic strip mirrors relevant topics such as corruption in the government and shows some of the problems the society faces. In the 90s, there was a sudden downfall in the comics industry. Production had declined because of the introduction of alternative platforms like television and the internet. From 200,000 copies a week of publication, the average circulation of comics dropped to 2,000 copies a week in 2004. People also became practical about purchasing comics, and most people who wanted to purchase them were young buyers. Another factor to this downfall was Filipinos diverted to telenovelas. Stories that were on comics were recreated as TV series. In 2004, a new group of young artists, writers, and fans called Comicero Artist Group organized the first Comic-Con convention at UP Diliman. From then on, many conventions are being held across the country in places like Baguio, Cebu, San Pablo City, Quezon City, Los Baños City, and Iloilo City. In 2007, Mango Comics and Sterling Paper Products collaborated to bring back low-cost traditional-style Filipino comics. The project was led by Carlo J. Caparas. When the Sterling Mango relationship ended, he created the National Comics Congress and the Comics Caravan. Sponsored by the National Commission for Culture and Arts, or the NCCA, the idea of the caravan was to lead script writing seminars and bring comic exhibits across the country. In the present time, a new generation of writers, artists, and publishers have taken over the comics industry, and they gather at Comic-Con. Comic-Con is a convention where artists, publishers, and writers gather to market and sell their work to fellow comic book fans. Thanks to the internet, some of the local comics showcased at Comic-Con are also available online through their websites or Facebook pages. And that's it. That's the history of the Philippine comic industry. Thanks for watching!
Ayan. Diyan na po nagtatapos ang ating discussion regarding comics. Okay? So, meron tayong activity dito regarding comics, no? So, after nito, i-announce natin ito sa Google Meet. Okay? That will be all. Goodbye.